There are some cases that feel especially cruel because of how ordinary they begin. No late-night highway, no dangerous neighborhood, no obvious warning signs, just a short walk in broad daylight to a store that was only a few minutes from home. For 15-year-old Kristy Wesselman, that was all it was supposed to be. A quick trip, a candy bar, a soda, then back home again. But Kristy never made it back. What followed was a nightmare that would haunt her family and the entire community for decades. Detectives chased lead after lead, questioned suspects, and uncovered strange details, but the truth remained buried. Then, after more than 30 years, the case was finally cracked. Not by a confession, not by a witness, but by a development that did not even exist when Kristy was murdered. And when the killer was finally identified, the truth raised another disturbing question. Could this have been prevented? This is the murder of Kristy Wesselman. Kristy Wesselman. Kristy Wesselman was born in April of 1970 and lived in Glen Ellyn, Illinois, with her family. By all accounts, she was exactly the kind of teenager people remember with warmth for the rest of their lives. She was social, athletic, well-liked at school, and active in class life. Reports later described her as a popular freshman, someone with friends, energy, and the kind of future that seemed wide open. In the summer of 1985, Kristy was just 15 years old. On July 21st, she returned home in the afternoon. At some point, she decided to make a quick trip to a nearby grocery store. It was not far, close enough that nobody had any reason to fear for her safety. According to later reports, Kristy left home to buy a candy bar, and in one account, her mother told her, "Be careful, princess, I love you." It was the kind of ordinary goodbye no one imagines will become their last. At first, when Kristy did not return, the delay may not have seemed catastrophic. In the mid-1980s, there were no mobile phones, no live location sharing, no instant way to check where someone was. A teenager being a little late could still be explained away. Maybe she ran into friends. Maybe she stopped somewhere. Maybe she simply lost track of time. But as the hours passed, that explanation became harder to believe. Her family started searching. Calls were made. Friends were contacted. Streets were checked. Eventually, fear replaced hope, and police were notified. Officers began by reconstructing Kristy's last known movements. They spoke with the clerk at the store, who knew her and confirmed that she had come in that afternoon, bought what she came for, and left. Nothing about her behavior seemed unusual. There was no obvious sign that she sensed danger, no indication that she knew she was being watched. Investigators checked with friends and neighbors, trying to determine whether Kristy had changed her plans. But no one had seen her after the store. Then, as the search continued into the next day, one investigator focused on something simple but important: the route she most likely would have taken home. Between Kristy's neighborhood and the store was a vacant lot with tall grass. Local kids often used it as a shortcut rather than walking the longer way around. A narrow path had formed there over time, worn down by repeated use. If Kristy wanted to get home quickly, there was a good chance she had walked through that field. The detective followed the path. A short distance off the trail, hidden in the grass, he found a body. It was Kristy. The horror of that moment is difficult to overstate. The trip had been short, the area was familiar, it was daytime. And still, somehow, she had been attacked, overpowered, sexually assaulted, and stabbed to death only yards away from a path people regularly used. Kristy's murder was not only brutal, it was baffling. Her body was found near a well-traveled route. Nearby, a family had reportedly been having a barbecue. A gas station employee had been working not far from the field. Yet no one reported hearing screams or seeing anything clearly suspicious. It was as if the attack had happened in a pocket of silence, hidden in plain sight. The medical findings made the case even more disturbing. Kristy had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. One report stated she had been stabbed at least 8 times, and another noted that a shoelace had been tied around her neck. Detectives also learned that a pearl ring she had been wearing was missing, leading them to wonder whether the killer had taken it as some kind of trophy. At the scene, investigators collected biological evidence from the attacker. Today, that sounds like the beginning of the end. But in 1985, DNA forensics was still in its early stages. The evidence was preserved, but there was no practical way to use it to identify a killer. The case would depend, for the time being, on old-fashioned police work, interviews, tips, suspect lists, and instinct. So detectives started close to home. They looked into the possibility that Kristy knew her killer. In a smaller community, that was not an unreasonable theory. If she had recognized the person who approached her, it might explain the eerie absence of screams or signs of a prolonged struggle. Police investigated men who knew her and men in the surrounding area with histories of violence. Over time, several names drew scrutiny. One of those names would become a tragedy all its own. A man named Dana Henry, who lived near where Kristy's body was discovered, fell under intense suspicion. Over time, police pressure on him became so extreme that years later he described it as the darkest period of his life. According to Henry, he was stripped, jailed for refusing to provide DNA, spent around $50,000 on legal fees, lost his house, and watched relationships with friends and even family collapse under the weight of suspicion. Yet in the end, his DNA did not match the evidence from the crime scene. He had never even met Kristy. Decades later, after the real killer was sentenced, Henry said closure never truly came, because what had been taken from him was never returned. That detail is important because it shows how cold cases often do more than haunt victims' families. They can also devastate the lives of people pulled into the investigation and publicly stained by suspicion. And still, despite the interviews, the theories, the pressure, and the years of work, Kristy's case remained unsolved. The biological evidence was eventually entered into a national DNA database in 2000, after advances in forensic science made that possible. And then, investigators waited. Nothing happened. Years passed. The case grew older. Detectives retired or moved on. Kristy's murder became one of those cases that people mention with a tone of resignation, the kind where everyone wants justice, but fewer and fewer believe it will ever come. Then, in 2015, the silence finally broke. Police received a notification that the DNA from Kristy's killer had matched a recently added profile in the FBI database. That profile belonged to a man named Michael Jones, then in his early 60s, living in Champaign, Illinois, roughly 150 miles away from where Kristy was killed. He had not been a known suspect in the original investigation. Detectives had not spent years circling around him. In fact, by all indications, they had never seriously had him on their radar at all. The match existed because Jones had recently provided DNA after a felony domestic battery case. Under Illinois law, people convicted of qualifying felonies must submit DNA samples. Prosecutors later pointed out something almost painfully ironic. A 2002 Illinois DNA law had been championed in part because of unsolved crimes like Kristy's. In other words, the legal change that helped identify her killer had grown, at least in part, from the frustration her own case had created. When investigators confronted Michael Jones, he reportedly denied knowing Kristy and denied ever being in Glen Ellen. But the DNA evidence was devastating. Jones had a violent criminal history dating back to the 1970s. Prosecutors said he had previously served time for raping and kidnapping a 27-year-old woman, and reports also stated that he had twice been convicted of raping women in that era. More chilling still, he had been released early, after serving only part of a longer sentence. According to authorities, he was on parole from one of those earlier violent crimes when Kristy was murdered in 1985. That revelation transformed the case from a cold case success story into something darker, because once Michael Jones was identified, people were forced to ask whether Kristy's murder might have been preventable. If a violent offender had served his full sentence instead of being released early, would Kristy still be alive? At sentencing, one of Jones's earlier victims said exactly that had he served at least the full minimum, we wouldn't be here today. Kristy's mother expressed the same frustration after justice finally came. There were other troubling details too. Investigators learned that Jones often made long solo motorcycle trips and traveled through areas that could have placed him near Glen Ellen. That may explain why he never appeared in the original suspect pool. He may not have been a local predator known to Kristy's family or neighbors. He may have been passing through, a dangerous man moving just outside the frame of what detectives could reasonably see in 1985. In 2015, Michael Jones was arrested and charged in Kristy's murder. But even then, the legal process dragged on. It would take years before the case was finally resolved in court. In January 2018, Jones pleaded guilty to the murder and sexual assault of Kristy Wesselman. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. Reports noted that he would not be eligible for parole until an age he was unlikely ever to reach, meaning he will almost certainly die behind bars. For Kristy's family, the sentencing brought a complicated kind of ending. Her mother described it as both a joyful day and a sad one. Joyful because the man responsible had finally been identified. Sad because justice, when it arrives 3 decades late, can never restore what was taken. Kristy was still gone. The life she should have had, adulthood, love, marriage, children, ordinary years, had been stolen in a field during a short walk home. That is one of the cruelest truths in cold case investigations. We often talk about a case being solved, as if that word means repaired. But solved does not mean undone. It does not mean healed. It does not give a family back the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments they lost. It only means that after years of darkness, the name of the person responsible is finally known. In Kristy's case, the final answer came from science, not from memory, not from conscience, not from luck in the traditional sense. Just preserved evidence, waiting for a future that had not yet arrived, and maybe that is what makes this case linger. A 15-year-old girl went to a nearby store and never came home. For 30 years, the truth sat hidden inside a sample collected from a crime scene, useless to the detectives who first held it, but powerful enough to one day expose a killer who thought time had erased him. It had not. Michael Jones was finally named. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 80 years. And after more than 3 decades, the black cloud that had hung over the case was, at least in legal terms, lifted. But even now, the case leaves behind difficult questions. How did no one hear anything? Did Kristy know him, or did he simply seize an opportunity in seconds? Was the missing ring a trophy? And how many lives were changed forever, not only by the murder itself, but by the long and painful years before the truth emerged? For Kristy's family, those questions may never fully disappear. And for everyone else, her case remains a chilling reminder that some of the most devastating crimes do not begin with obvious danger. Sometimes they begin with a trip to the store,